So, 4 key topics have been raised for this conference, and I've been invited to focus specifically on the topic searching for a renewal of religious education identity. Different European countries have different models for religious education in public education, related to various degrees of confessionalism. And as a starting point for my search, I will take Sweden and the way we approach the subject of RE in public schools. Right from the start, I want to make clear that it's not my aim to discuss how to name the subject in question. I'm also not going to question whether there are religions and worldviews to be seen. On the contrary, I think there is no doubt about it. My aim, though, is to add to the discussion on how to talk about the content of the subject and on how the content can be presented in a way that relates to young people nowadays. How can we provide enough space in the classroom for everyone to recognize themselves? And how can we contribute to a subject in which the relevance of religions and worldviews can be seen among young adults, even if they don't consider themselves as religious or as having a worldview? The kinds of concepts we use can either open or close classroom conversations and enable or disable the capacity of people to recognize themselves. Today, a growing consensus can be observed among researchers, not only in Sweden, that the concept of religion is not sufficient to describe and give space to the meaning-making of the diversity of individuals in society. As a result, discussions about worldviews have gained momentum. But I argue that not even the worldview concept and the choice to frame the subject of RE with this addition can solve the real problem, which is how young people can relate to the content of the subject in the first place. In my lecture, I will present the view that the concept of existential configurations is equipped to adequately capture a complex and personal understanding of life that not least can be observed among young people today. Furthermore, I will argue that this concept of existential configurations gives access to a theoretical language that enables individuals to understand their own existential meaning-making and to see how it relates to the plurality of religions and worldviews that can be encountered in society, even when they don't describe themselves as religious or as having a specific worldview. For me, the subject of RE should help young people develop a language for their own meaning-making and help them understand that religions and worldviews are shared configurations that are important to learn about if one wants to understand oneself and others. RE then becomes an important part of young people's democratic education and a factor of importance in preparing them for life in a society characterized by diversity. The theme of this conference makes it clear that the discussion about and the search for a renewal of religious education identity doesn't merely characterize the Swedish context in which I am situated. Recent educational policy documents in Europe highlight the need to re-evaluate education about religion and religious and non-religious worldviews in public education, and the importance of reconceptualizing powerful knowledge and 21st century skills in the RE classroom relevant to our time. In June 2020, our distinguished colleague Stephen Parker wrote the editorial in the Journal of Beliefs and Values. And with the perspective of an historian, he noticed, and I quote, that for a very long time RE has been a treadmill of dissatisfaction with itself. And he continues, persistent calls for reform go far and above normal levels of critical self-reflection and desires to improve in other areas of the curriculum. It strikes one that RE in England and Wales seems to be in an almost endless cycle of introspection and internal identity wars. In other words, there is a risk that my search for a renewal of religious education identity will add to this endless cycle of introspection and internal identity wars. but my intention is not to contribute to any wars, but to deepen the existing reflection together with you. The outline of my lecture is that I will start with a short account of RE in Sweden, from the 1500s until today. My idea is that a brief historical perspective on the Swedish context will give you the opportunity to relate and compare the Swedish situation with your own national context. Following this, I will offer some examples lifted from a discussion on how to describe and discuss people's understanding of life, a discussion that has been going on in Swedish religious studies since the 1960s. I will illustrate how different traditions within religious studies and education have chosen to emphasize different aspects of individuals' meaning-making. And the historical perspective in relation to the subject and the discussion how people's understanding of life ought to be described and discussed will be the background against which I will then present my own empirical research, which leads to the concept of existential configurations. And I will conclude my presentation by summarizing the points that I find important in my search for a renewal of religious education identity. So let me begin with giving you an historical account of RE in Sweden. Sweden is characterized by a history in which the development of the state, of religion in terms of Christianity and the Church of Sweden, and of education were closely interlinked. History tells that King Gustav Vasa saw the possibilities of using the church for consolidating the nation state, and subsequently he pushed through the Reformation. Following this, in 1593, the pure evangelical Lutheran doctrine was adopted as the only permitted religion, and Luther's catechism became a unifying ideology. In other words, the growing power of the church went hand in hand with the building of the Swedish nation. In the Protestant churches, the Bible occupied a prominent position, and early on the Swedish clergy drew attention to the importance of a literate population. Something which, I'm afraid, doesn't mean that the Swedish population can be described as religiously literate today. But that will have to be the topic for another lecture. General Elementary School was established in 1842, and the roots of what we now call RE constituted the very reason for the creation of a public educational system, since RE was the early school's main assignment. During this period, pupils were very much educated in religion. The great social transformation taking place in the second half of the 19th century, related to industrialization, urbanization, led to changed demands about the kind of knowledge schools had to provide, and mathematics and science were given a more prominent place in the curriculum. However, freedom of religion, in the sense that Swedish citizens were allowed to leave the Swedish church without entering another denomination, was only introduced in the 1950s. And once this freedom was in place, citizens could effectively leave the Swedish church without joining another congregation or so-called free churches, like the Baptist Church or the Jehovah's Witnesses. During the 19th century, RE never was at risk of disappearing from the curriculum, but with the reform of 1905, the subject was allotted less class hours, except for those who chose the classical program in upper secondary school. And during this period, the subject focused on learning from and more shifted to learning about religion. In the 1960s, the alliance between church, state and school was still going strong. But as you might know, Swedish society was colored by a strong political movement, and people began to question the church, as well as other institutions in society. Strong voices in society had already been arguing for a division between belief and knowledge, and being religious also became questioned in political terms during this period. At the same time, the pluralization of Swedish society became more pronounced, not least because of labor immigration. And all of this resulted in a stronger focus on learning about religion rather than on learning from. And Christianity was given a different position in the subject of RE during this time. This historical perspective brings us to the situation of Swedish RE today. Nowadays, unlike the RE given in many other countries, the Swedish subject is non-confessional and students are taught together regardless of their own backgrounds. Students with different relationships to and perceptions about the subject content meet in the classroom, leading to a subject that is characterized by a diversity of views and experiences hailing from students and teachers alike. And this is a phenomena that my distinguished colleague Caroline Klintborg has illustrated with very interesting examples in her studies. RE in the school is supposed to both teach students about religion and promote a continuous learning from religions. Today, the curriculum states that the objective in Sweden when teaching RE is to help pupils develop knowledge about religions and other outlooks on life in their own society and in other parts of the world. Here the term outlook on life is used to translate the Swedish term livsåskådning. It's a possible translation, but not an obvious one. A British translation of livsåskådning might be life view or life stance, while in the United States it would probably be translated as worldview. In my lecture, I use those words equivalent, as I believe I have already done. Putting aside translation problems, there is a question that remains the subject of ongoing discussions. Does the curriculum provide enough space for everyone to recognize themselves by providing two positions, those of religions and worldviews? And as I mentioned in my introduction, I think we can say that today a growing consensus can be observed among researchers, and not only in Sweden, that the concept of religion is not sufficient to describe and give space to the meaning-making of the diversity of individuals in society. And the result of this is that discussions about worldviews have gained momentum. But the point I'm making is that not even the worldview concept and the choice to frame the subject of RE with this addition can solve the real problem, which is how young people can relate to the content of the subject in the first place. In other words, making use of the worldview concept cannot bring us salvation alone. In my search for a renewal of RE identity, I argue that it's important to evaluate the kinds of concepts we use to discuss people's meaning-making. I have already touched upon this matter by pointing out that the kinds of concepts we use can either open or close classroom conversations. Our choice of concepts is important if we care about the ability of students to recognize themselves in the content of the subject. The important question is how the meaning-making of individuals in society can be discussed, both in teacher training programs in a school context where RE is taught, in a way that resonates with the students in the classroom, one that doesn't just lead to a discourse about the other. Nowadays, we require concepts that enable us to adequately capture a broader sense of meaning-making, as many traditions and formally approved ways of acting are being questioned. Notably, we can see today that individuals not necessarily lean on just one religion or worldview, but draw words and symbols from multiple religions and traditions when creating meaning in their own lives. Searching for a renewal of RE identity, I will bring in the concept of existential configurations. If we want students to participate as active partners in the creation of a new multicultural or intercultural European landscape, we need to give them access to a language, to concepts that enable them to relate their own meaning-making to other people's understanding of life. I think the RE classroom can be a space of importance in that regard. Students need to learn that how we interpret life is not about us and them, not about the division between those who are religious and those who are not, or those who have a specific worldview and those who do not. Speaking in terms of existential configurations creates opportunities for teachers' professional capacity to grow, and provides all students with a space to develop a personal attitude to life and an understanding of how they and others are thinking and living. These are concepts that create the opportunity to conceptualize individuals' meaning-making processes and clarify how the way we view life is linked to shared configurations. We are all part of a larger whole, spelled with a double V and not as a hole or a gap, as it can feel sometimes. I will now offer some examples lifted from a discussion on how to describe and discuss people's understanding of life. The discussion from which these examples are taken itself relates to a further ongoing discussion in Swedish religious studies since the 1960s. The question of how people's meaning-making can be adequately captured can also be framed in a broader Nordic and European context, a study field in which our distinguished colleague and my respondent, Sibra Miedema, is active. In a broad sense, one might say that different traditions within religious studies and education have chosen to emphasize different aspects of individuals' life-centered meaning-making. Meaning-making can be regarded as either a process or a content. Two different or converging foci where life questions will have a slightly different meaning. When regarded primarily as a content, life questions like the meaning of life and death are supposed to be answered by the individual in the form of a religion or worldview. When regarded primarily as a process, the questions are given more focus than the answers themselves, and it's the questions that are supposed to drive the process of interpretation. One example of this process can be seen among young adults I interviewed. For these youths, neither death nor the meaning of life indicated any key questions. But questions like, who am I? Where am I headed? Drove their meaning-making processes, and they expressed a wish to answer those questions in the context that surrounded them at the time we met. Different traditions within religious studies and education have also chosen to emphasize either the individual experiences or the cognitive elements in people's meaning-making. When comparing the different concepts used to describe how people interpret and understand life, the space and significance, given to the context or shared meaning-making in the context that surrounds an individual, compared to the impact of the individual herself, can also be another example of differences. One of the concepts chosen to describe and discuss people's understanding of life is that of worldview, what we in Sweden capture in terms of livsåskådning. In Sweden, the concept of livsåskådning was introduced in the 1970s by Anders Jeffner. His goal was to offer a new way to discuss people's life-centered meaning-making, and in launching this concept, he wanted to include a link with everyday terminology in Sweden, but at the same time introduce a theoretical tool suitable for studying individuals' understanding of life. The term is still used, as you have already seen, in the Swedish RE curriculum today. And Jeffner translates the term livsåskådning as life view when he states that by a person's life view is meant the person's central value system and basic attitude, and the part of what the person considers to know about him or herself and the surrounding world, which affects this central value system or basic attitude in a way that the person is prepared to accept. Jeffner's definition stresses that the individual has a kind of conviction, a theoretical standpoint which also determines the importance she or he attaches to life questions. Considered from Jeffner's perspective, then, a life question is a type of question that an individual answers within the framework of a livsåskådning or worldview. There are scholars like Carl Reinhold Bråkenhielm och Katarina Westerlund that use this concept in their research, but have criticized Jeffner's particular use of the concept. Specifically, they emphasize that more attention should be given to the impact of people's lived lives and the practical consequences of having a livsåskådning. But despite this criticism, other researchers like Mikael Lindfeldt argue that no real reformulation of the concept can be seen since it was first defined by Jeffner in Sweden. Not only in Sweden today, but also in other European countries, the worldview concept has been chosen to supplement the concept of religion. One example is the work presented by Sibre Miedema and his colleagues Giacomo van der Kooi and, I still hope you will excuse my pronunciation, Dorje de Ruyter in the Netherlands. In defining the worldview concept, these scholars make a distinction between personal and organized worldviews. And in an article in Religious Education, these three scholars analyze what they describe as the necessary characteristics of an organized worldview, and they conclude that an organized worldview is a view on life, the world, and humanity that prescribes answers to existential questions. This way, organized worldviews aim to influence the thinking and acting of people, and organized worldviews contain moral values and aim to provide meaning in people's lives. Further, when talking about personal worldviews, these researchers state that a personal worldview can be more eclectic and idiosyncratic than an organized worldview, and that a personal worldview is a view on life, the world, and humanity that consists out of norms, values, ideals that can be but are not necessarily moral, and out of answers to existential questions. Incomplete translation is a problem when the worldview concept is used to capture the meaning of the Swedish concept livsåskådning or the Dutch concept levensbeschouwing. The question in focus then is, can we sensibly translate the word life with world here? Moreover, Dutch researchers like Edwin van der Sande have raised the question whether the English worldview concept is sufficient altogether. The idea of Miedema, van der Kooi and de Ruyter, the three Dutch scholars I just mentioned, to make a distinction between personal and organized worldviews is interesting. But in the discussion what kinds of concepts we should use to open classroom conversations, we should pay attention to van der Sande again when he interprets the concept of personal worldviews as discussed them primarily by van der Kooi, and he notes that although precise articulation is not a requirement for having a personal worldview, it seems that van der Kooi's conceptualization prescribes that a person should at least have some type of answers, however vague or tentative. In a Nordic perspective, our distinguished colleague Oddrun Bråten argues in a similar way to our Dutch colleagues by making a distinction between personal and organized worldviews, saying that an organized worldview has developed over time as a more or less coherent system with sources, traditions, values, and ideals and a group of adherents. It prescribes answers to existential questions, includes moral values, and aims to influence thinking and action and provide meaning in life. And further, a personal worldview is a view of life, identity, the world, and existential questions that includes values and ideals. When interpreting the worldview concept as presented here by Dutch scholars and our Norwegian colleague Oddrun Bråten, it seems it has characteristics similar to the Swedish concept livsåskådning, as formally defined by Anders Jeffner. And this is said in spite of translation problems in regard to the concept of life and world. In spite of this good and important contribution of being able to talk in terms of a personal worldview, I find that this particular concept cannot do justice to the character of the ongoing reflection and flow of thoughts that seems to characterize young people today. There seems to be a gap between the current theoretical language used in RE and young people's life worlds. My main critique of the proposal to use the term personal worldview to capture people's life-centered meaning-making is that conceptually it relates to the notion of organized worldviews. When the term personal worldview is used, emphasis is placed on content. Individuals are supposed to have a kind of conviction and theoretical standpoint, which also determines the importance they attach to life questions. Viewed from this theoretical perspective, a life question is a type of question that an individual will answer within the framework of a worldview. Examples of life questions in this regard are: what are the meaning of life, and how can we endure suffering and death? Attention is given to answers to life questions rather than to people's authentic everyday dealing with life questions. The worldview concept as such also emphasizes reflected elements more than people's experiences, and in the same vein more attention is paid here to individuals, while insufficient consideration is given to the impact of the context in which people interpret their lives. The worldview concept has been shaped in a rationalistic discourse in which human beings are regarded more as observers than as participants. And this is an understanding of what we can say becoming human that I think needs to be thoroughly challenged. And consequently, a mere widening or transformation of our understanding of existing concepts is not the answer, I think. And I think that the way forward is to develop new concepts. The worldview concept has been challenged in Sweden by researchers like Kristina Osbeck, Gunnar Gunnarsson and myself. Kristina Osbeck, for her part, was inspired by Lögstrup and Bakhtin and decided to apply the concept of understanding of life. Gunnarsson, an Icelandic scholar who conducted his PhD research in Sweden, was in turn inspired by Sven Hartman and by Gadamer and Goethe and opted for the concept life interpretation. As for me, being inspired by Paul Ricoeur, the concept of existential configuration seemed to be an even better option. But some similarities can be observed between the three of us and still other researchers who have been criticizing or at least challenging the worldview concept. And one point all of us have been trying to make is that the focus should be shifted from an emphasis on content and a relatively substantial cognitive philosophical concept to a more dynamic concept with room for processes as part of people's meaning making. I would now like to give an example of young people's dynamic life questions and the use of the concept of existential configurations taken from my own empirical research. While conducting my PhD research some years ago, I interviewed young adults between the ages of 19 and 29, of which 8 described themselves as Christian believers, and the remaining 13 spoke of themselves as non-believers positioned in relation to the Christian tradition. I was curious to discover how these young people related to life questions and interpreted their lives. To begin, I conducted 3 pilot interviews, and an interesting observation during the interviews was that answering life questions related to defined issues like the meaning of life and death seemed to be difficult for my interviewees. I soon discovered that they didn't have a lot of things to say in that regard, but the answers I received seemed to reflect some very complex meaning-making processes, which circulated around questions rather than answers. And inspired by narrative theory, these interview experiences led me to decide to give my interviewers the necessary space during interviews to describe their existential meaning-making without having to relate these meanings to pre-formulated categories like what is the meaning of life or how can we endure suffering and death. Inspired by Paul Ricoeur, I drew particularly upon a hermeneutic perspective. I then conducted my interviews with the intention to create opportunities for adapting my questions to the specific features of the interview situation, and with the goal to capture the respondents' personal thoughts and experiences. The interviews I conducted can, as already mentioned, be described as deep and semi-structured, and the interview focus became important events in the young adults' lives. Listening to my presentation, you might object that what I'm saying just concerns the differences between what is found on the data level on the one hand and found at the more theoretical level based on analysis on the other. However, the point I want to make is that it's easy to lose important characteristics found in the data when trying to make the findings understandable for an academic audience, attempting to make them comparable with the categories we are already used to. In fact, this is one of the main points I want to make, that our existing concepts and theories of people's life-centered meaning-making seem unable to capture some of the basic characteristics of complexity and plurality inherent in ordinary people's approaches to existential matters. These particular characteristics seem, so to speak, to get lost in translation. Therefore, in order to reach my goal to interpret how contemporary young adults describe and understand their lives, I discovered that I had to try to develop a new kind of theoretical concept that can help us to truly understand and talk about individuals' meaning-making. And this concept of mine, existential configurations, and concepts that are related to it, like shared configurations, are a work in progress to try to outline and further explore a theoretical language that allows us to do exactly this, and to investigate how people's meaning-making relates to different social and cultural contexts. When telling me about their lives, the interviewees' statements seemed quite spontaneous and not organized by conscious reflection. Their meaning-making turned out to be far more complex, fragmentary and situational than allowed for by the concept worldview. The concept of existential configurations reflects this complexity, not only in everyday life, but also theoretically. It's a concept that provides space for both questions and answers. The existential configuration is not the forever given answer. In this sense, the concept of existential configurations provides space for both process and content, signaling, so to say, that it's possible to refigure your existential configurations. And as a concept, it builds on the idea that the way individuals understand their own lives is dependent on the surrounding context and the configurations we share. How people create meaning, how they explore and develop their understanding of life, is viewed as an individual process and simultaneously as something that is socially shared. I will now try to illustrate some aspects of this complexity by using a short excerpt from one of my interviews with Elin, a 22-year-old. The interview fragment illustrates how difficult it is to understand these young adult statements in terms of a specific worldview. So I'm baptized and I made my confirmation, but I'm not a believer at all. Or I believe in something, but it's like, I can't say that I belong to a religion or something, but I am a Christian, but I'm not a believer. This quote was part of Elin's answer to the question whether she was baptized. And looking at her answer, the question can be asked whether Elin has a Christian or a secular worldview. For Elin, there is no traditional connection between baptism, confirmation, faith, or between religion, faith, being a Christian. The complexity of her statement relates to concepts like faith and religion, but her statement also illustrates the difficulty inherent in using the concept worldview, if a worldview is understood as something that involves an individual's reflected decision. Regardless of the fact whether or not Elin possesses a Christian faith, this interview excerpt illustrates how Elin, like other young adults I met, cannot be said to adhere to a specific worldview in a straightforward sense, meaning in terms of a set of predefined categories. Elin hadn't made a reflected choice in relation to a given set of worldviews, but, perhaps more importantly, in the course of her interview, she expressed a personal interpretation and an understanding of life. And based on what I sketched as an historical background earlier, you might see how Elin's statements are influenced by secular Swedish society and the particular context in which she grew up. Based on an analysis of my empirical material, I argue that the concept of existential configurations adequately captures these interestingly complex and personal understandings of life that are not necessarily thought through or stable. To put it differently, these are understandings of life that may still change over time. More to the point, the definition of the concept of existential configuration reads that it summarizes the individual's self-understanding in a given context, both in terms of a process and content, and in terms of a social and a personal dimension. Put it yet another way, when speaking in terms of existential configurations, the meaning-making process can only be interpreted and understood when it's situated in a social context, even though it's expressed by an individual. My motivation for using the concept existential configurations has also been based on my observation that while the interviewees didn't talk about their understanding of life in terms of given traditions, they nevertheless had distinct interpretations of important events in their lives. Interpretations that might best be described as different meaningful figures in Paul Ricoeur's sense, like figures of thought, small narratives about different events in their lives, not necessarily consciously thought through. During my analysis of the interview material, I could see how the interviews shaped their interpretations of individual events and how they simultaneously saw their experiences as part of a larger whole. Their statements couldn't be understood without understanding the larger context that surrounded them. The way they seemed to combine different figures into a whole suggested to me the use of configurations. And here the prefix "con" is used to refer to the phenomena that different figures have been joined together. Specifically in my analysis, I could see that the interviewees expressed personal views on individual events and existential themes out of a desire to make their lives understandable, and this in relation to people around them and the context they shared with these significant others. This was more important to them than answering traditional life questions like what is the meaning of life. In conclusion, my interviewers seemed to be engaged in the effort to combine their experiences into a meaningful whole, in light of ideas that were shared in a community, which included significant others with whom they shared a plausibility structure in the meaning of Berg and Luckman, significant others in whose company they could feel ontological security, in the sense of Giddens' terminology. In conclusion, in my search for a renewal of RE identity, I would like to underline the importance of using concepts that make it possible for students to relate their own lives and individual meaning-making to the content of the subject. Following that perspective, the concept of religion and worldview are insufficient when discussing new approaches to RE. I don't even think that the proposal to speak in terms of personal worldviews will be enough, since it leaves us with the main problem unsolved. The chief problem is how young people can relate their own life questions and meaning-making to the content of the subject in the first place. The concept of a personal worldview doesn't provide sufficient space for the kinds of life questions that really occupy young people today. Like, who am I? What would I like to choose? And where am I headed? I think that using the concept of worldview, even when further qualified by using the term personal, only adds to the idea that individuals must have answers ready in order to be able to talk in terms of a worldview. I can see how the word personal captures the individual side, but I believe the risk here is that we focus too much on the individual and static personality and downplay the importance of the surrounding context for the individual's meaning-making process, in which also a refiguration can take place. The term personal also tends to be used in an everyday sense that loses sight of life experience complexity, a complexity that I think can best be captured and described by using a theoretical and well-developed concept. And when I observed how young adults narrated their lives in my interviews, the theoretical work of Ricoeur seemed to be the best resource in that regard. At the research level, my hope is that in spite of different theoretical starting points, the current conceptual deliberation will lead to greater clarity and to an intensification of the research into the meaning-making processes of not least young people. At the educational level, my hope is that the use of a varied range of concepts will provide a linguistic opportunity and an invitation for talking about the context, culture, and traditions that have influenced students' understanding of themselves and life. Such conversations can subsequently make students better equipped to understand and communicate with the other. The ability of students to become active partners in the creation of a new multicultural or intercultural European landscape, I believe, will grow if teachers give them access to a language and to concepts that enable them to relate their own meaning-making to other people's understanding of life. By using the terminology of existential configurations and shared configurations, opportunities can be created to help pupils realize that their own understanding of life is linked to that of the various religions and worldviews currently being practiced in Europe and in the wider world, whether they personally regard themselves as religious, having a worldview or not. By drawing on the terminology of existential and shared configurations, one acknowledges that a person's understanding of life is an ongoing process in which questions can be more significant than the answers themselves. For those of you who like to read more about this concept development, I have written some publications in English and one together with Martin Rothgangel in German. I have also written some publications in Swedish for those of you who will learn the language or who already knows it by heart. So by that, I will say thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this new way of approaching a keynote will have inspired some of you, and I hope to hear from you. You're always welcome to mail me with questions and thoughts to share.
So I have given the title to my keynote response, Need the concept of personal worldview be replaced or should it be elaborated? And I start off with a quote. Bas, 15 years old, says, this course is called Religion Worldview. And just to explain that, this is a course in the Dutch third grade pre-vocational secondary school with non-affiliated pupils. So the course is called Religion and Worldview. And Bas continues, if you consider it as two parts of the subject, I am not captivated by religion so much. But regarding worldview, I think more or less like, yes, this does appeal to me. And this is a quote from an article by Minnaar and Kuiper and Bertrand Troost in 2020 in the British Journal of Religious Education. And this reaction is, in my opinion, a very interesting quote because these adolescents between 14 and 16 years old were not affiliated with or involved in institutionalized religious worldviews. Bas does feel excluded in the narrative religion. The notion of worldview, on the contrary, opens a window for him. In other words, he could feel himself included in this narrative. In this 2020 article in BTRE, Minnaar, Kuiper and Bertrand Troost are focusing in the interviews with the pupils on their worldview formation process and on potential influential factors and sources in these processes. The pupils emphasize that they are in charge of their own worldview formation process and are choosing their own norms and values, for example, friendship, happiness, being safe, equality, and answer to life questions from various factors and sources, such as parents, siblings, friends, major events, the media, hobbies, school in general, and more specific, the course, religion and worldview I just referred to. These choices are not randomly adopted, but they use their own reasoning abilities to judge possibly worldview-related ideas, opinions, and practices. Trust or distrust in the factors and sources, and being close to someone or to a source is playing a crucial role in their choices. School is not playing a significant role in the pupils' worldview formation processes in terms of commitment and exploration. This in contrast to the still important influence of the parents, because the pupils trust their parents the most. The inclusivity of all pupils was one of the reasons why Jacobijn van der Kooi, Dorette Ruiter and myself have chosen to use the concept of worldview in 4 related and published articles in academic journals in which we provide, first, an analytical conceptualization of that concept of worldview, conceptualize the influence of moral education on the personal worldview of pupils, third, trace the influence of teaching morality on the worldview of pupils, and fourth, show the merits of using worldview in religious education. The article by Minna Kuiper and Bertram Troost, based on empirical research, is, in my view, a very adequate example of using the concept of personal worldview in a school context and with non-affiliated adolescent pupils. In her keynote presentation, Caroline is referring to our 2013 article, and she poses, as it seems, serious questions in respect to our, and probably others, conceptualization of the notion of personal worldview. If I see it right, her criticism is sixfold. I will just mention it, and when I deal with the criticism, I will repeat that. So the first criticism is the concept of personal worldview is conceptually related to the notion of organized worldview, conceptually related. Second, emphasis placed on content instead of also making room for processes as part of people's meaning making. Content instead of processes. 3, individuals are supposed to have a kind of conviction and theoretical standpoint which determines the importance they attach to life questions or existential questions. So pupils need to have a kind of conviction and theoretical standpoint. Fourth, the focus is on answers to life questions rather than on people's authentic everyday dealing with life questions. Answers to life questions versus authentic everyday dealing with life questions. Fifth, the worldview concept also emphasizes reflected elements more than people's experiences. So more reflective, and also the term cognitive is used instead of people's experiences. And last, 6, attention is paid more to individuals than on the impact of the context in which people interpret their lives. So individuals versus context in which people interpret their lives. If I see it right, the core of Caroline's argumentation is that the concept of religion is not adequate enough to describe the meaning making among diverse individuals in society, and we agree with that. We are completely in agreement with that. But in her view, also the concept of worldview cannot deal adequately with the way how young people can relate to the content of the subject of meaning making. We, as researchers and professional educators, need the concept of existential configurations to adequately capture a complex and personal understanding of life among young adults today. This concept will also enable individuals themselves to understand their own existential meaning making. And if I understand this right, I come back to that at the end, then this seems to be a kind of meta-reflexive tool to be used by young adults themselves. But we can talk about that later. The core question for me is, am I convinced by her and also Edwin van der Sander's criticism in his 2018 doctoral dissertation of the notion of worldview, more specifically of our use of the concept of personal worldview? I don't think so. and let me explain this to you. First, a clarification of our approach, especially in the 2013 article, but also in the other articles. The approach in our 4 articles was based on the methods of systematic review of literature and conceptual analysis or clarification, methods especially practiced in the analytic tradition in philosophy and philosophy of education. No qualitative or quantitative empirical research was related to our approach in this published work. This doesn't mean that our theoretical work excludes further empirical elaboration. And I think the very nice article by Kuiper Minnaar and Bertrand Troost is a nice example that empirical research is very fruitful. So this doesn't mean that our theoretical work excludes further empirical elaboration. On the contrary, it could be best interpreted as heuristically theoretical work that might be very helpful in using clear and distinct theoretical and methodological concepts in empirical research. Thus, we follow here also the practical term in the analytic tradition in philosophy and philosophy of education since the 1980s and 1990s, for example, manifest in the writings of the British philosopher of education, Paul Hurst. And this implies that conceptual analysis is not dealing with the interrelations of concepts as such, and thus as a method sui generis, but that such analyses are carried out with an eye on empirics and praxis too. That's just the method. I now want to deal with Caroline's 6 criticisms. The first criticism was, I just repeated, the concept of personal worldview is conceptually related to the notion of organized worldview. The concept of worldview is the overarching concept, and organized worldview and personal worldview are, in our conceptual analysis, relative autonomous subconcepts. And we clearly state that a personal worldview is not necessarily based on religious organized worldviews, not necessarily based on religious organized worldviews. It's very clear, I think. Second criticism, emphasis is placed on content instead of also making room for processes as part of people's meaning making. We have made an analytical distinction between 2 conceptions. So we have the concept of worldview, and we have 2 conceptions of personal worldview. A first conception consisting of certain norms, values, and ideals. A second conception where also the practices that arise from these norms, values, and ideals are included. So practices and processes could in this second conception next to content be part of the concept of personal worldview. Our analysis was not a prescriptive one, it was a descriptive one. And so in our own preference, it's the second one. Criticism 3, individuals are supposed to have a kind of conviction and theoretical standpoint which determines the importance they attach to life questions or existential questions. Related to existential questions, we clearly state that analytically speaking, from the perspective of a personal worldview, no clear-cut answers are necessary or sufficient condition for speaking about a personal worldview. There might be rather fake answers. A person could be in search of a personal worldview or exploring a worldview. Exploring is a practice, is an action, it's a process. The idea of a personal worldview implies that someone has this worldview, and having a worldview means that it is not a theoretical construct, but has impact on someone's life. In terms of the phenomenologist Max van Manen from Canada, it is a lived experience. I have put the 4th, the 5th, and 6th criticism together. So the 4th was the focus is on answers to life questions rather than on people's authentic everyday dealing with life questions. The 5th one is the worldview concept also emphasizes reflective elements more than people's experiences. And 6th, attention is paid more to individuals than on the impact of the context in which people interpret their lives. A crucial term in our description of the concept of personal worldview is based on the book Man's Search for Meaning by psychiatrist Viktor E. Frankl. That is, experiencing meaning in life. We wrote, quote, individuals are strongly motivated to find personal meaning, to understand the nature of their lives, and to feel that it is significant. Research shows that people find meaning in life by undertaking activities like their work and hobbies, and by having a relationship with, for example, their friends, family, and children. By giving meaning to these activities and relationships, they are able to attribute meaning to life. In my chapter, Personal Worldview, Existential Questions, and Inclusive Pedagogy, Theological and Pedagogical Underpinnings, in the 2018 edited book, Challenging Life, Existential Questions as a Resource for Education, by Yada Ristinini, Gershaye, and Karin Sporre, I have elaborated on these issues and presented the long-term, transformative, hermeneutical, critical, and pragmatic pedagogical paradigm behind my view on personal worldview formation. And I did it also in an earlier article in the Journal for the Study of Religion that was a special issue for Cornelia Roux. I have coined that the self-responsible self-determination, Langeveld, of the students in respect to worldview and religions. And also in neo-Vygotskian terms, I coined that their own actorship and authorship should be stimulated. With Wolfgang Klafke, I emphasize the stimulation in freedom and self-consciousness of the personal self and co-determination of children and youngsters, thus realizing at the same time sociality and solidarity. And I follow John Dewey when he defines experience as the transactional relationship of humankind and his environment. An environment that is always cultural or cultivated, and in that sense, a meaningful environment and context. That relationship is holistic in nature. It encompasses the whole person, and it's characterized by doing and undergoing, and with knowledge and function that is in service of the transactional relationship. Knowledge is for Dewey the possible relationship between actions and the consequences of these actions. The process of education, including worldview education, is a continuous reorganization and reconstruction of experience in which the experience might result in richer meanings for the person, and these will guide a future meaningful experience as well. So what we didn't do in the 4 articles is outlining the philosophy of education behind or related to our conceptual analysis of the notions of worldview, being personal worldview and organized worldview. I did that in 2018 and earlier also in 2014. And I think it's clear that the criticism Caroline has formulated really doesn't hold when taking into account this, what I would call a pedagogical paradigm at the background of and the foreground of the work we did on personal worldview and organized worldview as well. Caroline is proposing the concept of existential configurations as a more adequate concept. My 2 questions here are, what is the connotation of this concept precisely? And is the concept of existential configurations incompatible and or incommensurable in Kuhnian terms with the notion of personal worldview? First, question 1. I found 2 definitions of the concept of existential configurations nearly at the end of the keynote, page 13. First definition, the concept of existential configuration summarizes the individual's self-understanding in a given context, both in terms of process and content, and in terms of a social and a personal dimension. The second one, when speaking in terms of existential configurations, the meaning-making process can only be interpreted and understood when it is situated in a social context, even though it is expressed by an individual. Caroline writes, quote, While the interviewees didn't talk about their understanding of life in terms of given traditions, they nevertheless had distinct interpretations of important events in their lives. Events not necessarily conscious thought through. End of quote. She saw during her analysis of the interviews, quote, how the interviewees shaped their interpretations, and in Recurrian terms, meaningful figures, of individual events, and saw their experience as part of a larger whole. Their statements could not be understood without understanding the larger context that's surrounding them. The way they seemed to combine different figures, as interpretations, into a whole suggested to me the use of configurations. End quote. I see that the interviewees express personal views on individual events and existential themes out of a desire to make their lives understandable, and this in relation to the people around them and the context they shared with these significant others, in whose company they could feel ontological security. End of quote. Finally, comparing the empirical research of Minna Kuiper and Bertrand Troost on the worldview formation processes of adolescence, to which I referred in the beginning of my response, and the empirical research project of Caroline, I just see a lot of similarities. No traditional binding, their own interpretations, influence of significant others based on trust or, in Caroline's terms, ontological security. There's no incompatibility or incommensurability. Probably the only difference might be that the adults were able to shape in the interviews their own interpretation to a larger whole. And from the adolescents, this was not mentioned. It might be overlooked here by Kuiper, Minnaar, and Gerdien Bertrand Troost, or it may also be an age issue, adults versus adolescents, because in her research, Caroline dealt with adults, and Kuiper, Minnaar, and Bertrand Troost were dealing with adolescents, 14 to 60 years old. Or matters of degree in semantic mastery or different skills in expression. I cannot answer this. And this is characterized by Caroline as existential configurations. I interpret this as an useful, theoretical, analytical, and descriptive addition in using the concept of personal worldview. It has become clear to me that the concept of existential configurations, the term is which the researcher has developed on the basis of the analysis of the empirical data, the analyzed interviews. However, one of Caroline's aims was also, as I have formulated it in the beginning, that the concept of existential configurations will also enable individuals themselves, adults, and I would question, also adolescents, to understand their own existential meaning making. So this is what I called earlier the kind of meta tool. Do I understand it right, that this seems to be a kind of, yes, meta-reflexive tool to be used by young adults and adolescents themselves in order to get better grip on their own meaning-making processes and contents? But I'm puzzled here, because in her 2018 chapter in Challenging Life, Existential Questions as a Resource for Education, the book I just referred to, Caroline clearly states that, quote, the concept of existential configuration is a theoretical concept produced through the analysis of empirical material, but not something perceived by a person herself. So I'm puzzled here. I thank you for a very interesting paper, Caroline, and I am, of course, really curious to learn your reaction to my response. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
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 I don't know how to look. Thank you for your response. And you know, or probably all of you know, that we've been discussing this topic before. And we I don't know if we agree or disagree, I'm not really sure. But the question you asked me about how to use the concept, over the years we have tried to use it in teacher education at Stockholm University. And then we used it as a theoretical tool to help the pupils see the situation they're dealing with in the classroom when talking about religions and worldviews. So it has been a theoretical meta-theoretical concept they have learned to use, so to say.
Yeah, and these are students. They are not. They are adults.
They are adults and they are becoming teachers.
Yeah.
And the way I look at the concept is like I compared it with studies in language. When you need to know about substantiv och adjektiv och verb. What's I don't know what it's called in English then. You need to know how to talk about the content of a sentence. You don't do that on a daily basis, but you need to know about the content of the concepts used if to understand your own way of approaching a new language. So I look at existential configurations in the same way, that it's a theoretical tool that you don't perceive that you have it in the way that you go around and feel that you have an existential configuration, because it's an ongoing process. But it's what we have seen in the practice is that when talking about worldviews and religions, they seem to be relate to them in the same way. Students, or also in the grundskola, in the primary school, seem to look at them as predefined categories. You are supposed to relate to a worldview. So they're not talking about, so when saying that you can look at, with this notion about existential configuration, you can approach the subject in another way, not presenting predefined categories, but say that we are all meaning making, and
if I may interrupt, that's precisely what Bas, 50 years old, is saying. So he is a pre-vocational training school. So so these are mostly students, pupils who work with their hands, but of course also need their head. So there is the theoretical and the practical combined there. And if his reaction was very adequate, I thought. So religion, it's not my piece of cake, my words. But so, worldview, that's the broader. Okay, I can deal with that. And so what I just refer to is that these pupils there in this school and in the research, they were able to make up their own mind, and were using these terms and just could explain in the interviews what for them was meaningful, and how they were meaning making, and how the sources and relations and factors played a role, because sources and factors, meaning maker, were also theoretical terms for the researchers. But the hardcore of the empirical research is that these youngsters are able, in the interview, to tell their own story, to present their own narratives. And of course, if you will interview them next year, hermeneutically, it's an ongoing story, isn't it? It's the same in our lives.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
No, I'm not afraid. I'm lucky with that.
I wish for this whole sometimes. No, but not joking aside, I can see what your point, the point you're making, Sibra, and I think that we agree in many senses. But I think that the way forward for me in religious education is to open the classroom for everyone to recognize themselves.
Yeah, of course.
And I, at least in the Swedish perspective, we can see that we have troubles doing that, because it's like the topic seems to be related to predefined categories.
Yeah.
And in that sense, many of our students also relate to livsåskådningar in the same way.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have a secular worldview or a political worldview, and then they seem to go into the same categories as they relate to religion. So by open the classroom and talk about that we don't need to have answers to those questions about the meaning of life, and
I'm completely with you. And it's for us as researchers, we can use categories to classify, but the hardcore for a pedagogy of praxis is that are the students, the pupils, able to take responsibility, self-responsibility and self-determination, and also related to worldview and religion, and we need to give them the space, the place, and the support to develop that. So it's the development of their own stance, and that's always also in our life temporary. So today we are here, tomorrow we are there, and picked up your point, and I think that's an interesting one. So with older older students, also in the university and higher education in general, but also people in the church who are dealing with their own personal worldview, how are they more used to reflect and on their own stances? Just if they are telling a story, they can reframe the story as well by bringing in new elements. And that's why I said I'm curious to see whether also the adolescents are able to use this kind of method or are they able to reinterpret if they're just telling the interviewer what they experience and how they see life, etc. So I'm curious, and I think that's the elaboration for me of the concept of existential configurations.
How to use it, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's like subject or predicat and everything else. Then we try to. Our pupils are not stupid in that sense. I mean, they can grasp this theoretical work. I mean, I think it's we have troubles presenting the subject of religion, at least in Sweden. I mean,
yeah, you have a problem. I learned that.
Problem to make it interesting, to make it seems to be of meaningful for all of them. And by talking about existential configuration, my point is also to see that we share configurations. That being a Buddhist in Sweden is not the same as being a Buddhist in Thailand, for example, because the context.
Of course.
Exactly. So this is a way to not talk about a worldview, that you are religious, a Christian, or you have a secular worldview, because that will depend on the context that surrounds you.
Yeah.
So, and I know that you agree, Simon, but I think that existential configuration is a way to talk about it.
And in Sweden, you should take that more serious into account.
Yeah, and we try to, because when we in teacher training, we have used different narratives, and we have given the students the opportunity to analyze them in terms of existential configurations, and also use these terms of shared configurations and the ability to refigure.
And what do you actually offer them then? What is the kind of concept of the method? Are you presenting some elements of a existential configuration, or yes, are you? That's so I'm still puzzled. Using as a researcher the notion of it's fine for me. That's the way that the interpretation is ongoing, etc. The figures that go. So the narrative never stops, and it's always more sophisticated and nuanced. So Deweyan speaking, richer experiences, richer insights, richer knowledge, etc.
Sorry, you meant that it was a question. Is it part of the definition, you mean?
What do you present to your students in the teacher training?
For example, we use different narratives. We have a program in Sweden called Sommar i P1, where people most of the time present their own lives. Yeah, and yeah, it's special. But 2 hours they can talk about themselves. But
nice for narcissistic people.
Yeah. Exactly. Many of them are famous. They are quite narcissistic, maybe. But no. But then we use one of the programs, especially about he's not alive anymore. He's dead. He took his own life, and but he was a Buddhist who made well, it's an example of a story, a narrative from a person's life. Mm-hmm. When they get the ability to see how another person narrate his or her life. Mm-hmm. By using the concept that they can see how the social context has affected the narrative being presented. Mm-hmm. Like I could see in my interviews that I met with Christian believers, so to say, who struggled with their own idea of God, and the shape of God changed dependently on the context that surrounded them. Mm-hmm. So the concepts will be of help in interpreting how it works. Yeah. And by using them, they get hold of the idea that they are themselves presenting existential configurations.
Yeah, that's an interesting, because the article I referred to in the BTRE,
The one I wrote.
these 2020. So the students were non-affiliated, but the school is denominational. It's a Christian school, and so what they present religion and worldview, religion/worldview as a course, and so the reaction of the student who is non-affiliated says, the first part, you can, for me, my word, you can leave it out, and I follow the second track, so the worldview track. So and that's interesting, because it's in the context of a particular Christian school, although the identity of Christian schools, and we have published a lot of that, it's not orthodox, it's not just transmission oriented, it's transformative, it's inviting the students also to present their own self-identity and work on their self-development, etc., in the class and also in the school.